Perfect. Hello again. Thank you for accepting to do this with me. This is the part 2 of our interview. Let me do like a small recap. In the previous interview, we talked about you personally. We talked about your identity, how you prefer to present yourself. We talked about the legacies. We talked about passion, how you went from one different dream to another, and then the dream got bigger and bigger. We talked about your first ever book and your last book at the end. Now I'd like to go on more general or things where you could address your opinion or things from your previous work as well. So the first question would be, how is peace research education impacting the world? How is peace research or peace research, not just peace education, but peace research in general, how is it impacting or benefiting the world?
It's a good question. I just wrote a little state of the field essay yesterday, actually, for one of our academic journals. And I said in it that I think in some ways the field is hard to qualify and quantify in many ways. Mainly because I think different people, especially maybe over the last 10, 15 years, define peace studies and peace research and peace education slightly differently. We have, from the beginning, from the origins in the late 60s and especially the 1970s, we had a group of dedicated academics, mainly university-based and college-based professors in history, sociology, anthropology. We had philosophers, we had some economists, we certainly had some political scientists and the like, mainly the social sciences, and mainly people who had some, in the most part, fairly recent peace movement activities. They were involved in anti-Vietnam War activities, or involved in civil rights and anti-racist activities. And then as the 70s and 80s were on, anti-nuclear power and disarmament work. So they were looking to explore those issues in their classes with their students, but not necessarily as an organized field of academic pursuit and study. So they were activist professors who wanted a space to be able to be together, a space to talk amongst themselves and support one another. In many cases, especially in the early days, campuses were hotbeds of political activity. So they wanted a space to be able to, again, support one another, support the students, and figure out how to be activist academics. That changed, I think, in the late 70s and 80s, especially in the 80s, when we began to see the development of college-level curriculum on things like sometimes the base of the work itself, studies on contemporary peace movements, what were the effects of the anti-war movements in terms of Vietnam and Southeast Asia, what were the methodologies used and how successful were they. In other words, peace studies became, for a time, or a piece of it at least, a study of peace movements and their effectiveness or lack thereof. There also began to be studies of the particular concerns of the world. What is the nuclear threat really? What does it mean? Groups like, and now here we start getting hard scientists. We started getting groups like the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which was a group of nuclear physicists and related colleagues looking at what the threat really meant. That extended greatly and extends to this day in terms of climate scientists who are concerned with the climate catastrophe and do that work as part of their study, as well as part of their struggle, part of their activist work. And so as curriculum developed across multidisciplinary curriculum on peace studies, so too did the field. And we begin to get a whole generation of people, and now several generations of people, who got certificates and then got whole undergraduate degrees, eventually graduate degrees, and now doctorates in peace studies or some related thing, peace studies. I would say also, as the 80s wore on through the late 80s and 90s, we began to see a great increase in what I would still say a subdivision of the field called conflict studies or conflict resolution studies. So here you got everything from, on the one hand, war strategists, people who who were analyzing military strategies, and not always with a critical eye, saying, well, we have to get rid of all militaries or all armies and armed forces, which some of our people would say, but rather saying, how do we best resolve the conflicts we have? How do we resolve the conflicts in creative form? How do we resolve the conflicts in forms that actually involve the people most affected? What kinds of mediations, what kinds of negotiations work best? Is there a certain level of people-to-people mediation? What role do governments and non-governmental organizations play? So-called tier 4 mediation, techniques, and that became a great area of study. And also, on the other end, we had an influx of social workers and people who were actually just dealing with the effects of war and violence and a lack of peace on local societies. So you had a certain sector of the field now looking at trauma and what various effects of the traumas of war had on people, and how rehabilitation could be done in post-war and post-conflict situations. So that was the 80s and 90s. The field is growing and growing exponentially. So that's a good history. Now you're asking, I'm not answering your question, which is, where are things at now? And I think now we're really at a point of trying to figure out how to bring these different forces together. As we've expanded and had subgroups, so you might have the social workers over here, you might have the war college people over there, you might have the traditional peace activists over here, and you'll have some social scientists and hard scientists who don't always necessarily get together. Also with an influx, for IPRA at least, of a true internationalism, you have area studies, you have African, Latin American, Asia Pacific studies, and looking particularly at peace through those lenses. And I guess the other piece I'd say is that we're beginning to see new areas that are trying to branch out in new ways. There's a subfield, I'd say now, called resistance studies, which I'm somewhat involved with. So what does it mean to have a more direct actionist and resistance approach? What does it mean to have an approach that's directly critical, not in a sectarian way, but in a what is the root of our work kind of way, at fields of study that purely look at reform campaigns, because almost all campaigns are reform campaigns. It's very, very hard to envision and to implement a revolutionary campaigns. But if revolution, and especially nonviolent revolution, is an area of concern for us, if we're looking for a full peace and justice, which we don't think we'll get just by tinkering a small thing here and there, how does one look at resistance, at people's unarmed resistance, at massive civil society organizing? How does one look at that in a way that's more critical than the general field? So resistance studies comes into play as a subset of the field. We have exciting new initiatives also, even just in this past year. There's a new grouping really looking to build upon something that's existed for a little while in a few places, but hasn't really been a major piece of the field per se, and that is looking at museums. So people into museum studies are saying, well, there are specific peace museums. Okay, we know a couple of them here and there. We know that Japan has some great peace museums, especially in the places that were most affected by war. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the dropping of the atomic bombs. There are certainly museums that commemorate the genocides in Rwanda, in Kigali, but also outside the capital and other parts. So, the idea of peace or peace and justice museums is a whole new area opening up in a big way. And we've had now for a while, but again, not for 40 or 50 years, but maybe more for 10 or 15, a whole field which is also a subfield growing within peace studies, called peace journalism, where you have journalists who recognize that you can't ever fully be impartial, that all journalism has a certain partiality to it. And so peace journalism that specifically looks at the contours of conflict and ending conflict, or creating a post-conflict societies, is a field within journalism that needs greater attention. So all this is to say that I think the state of the field now and our impact is hard to judge. It's hard to judge because we're a little bit all over the place, and because we are so multidisciplinary, and because we have so many different ideologies and peoples coming into play. That said, it seems to me clear that the field of peace research and peace studies generally is growing by leaps and bounds. It's growing tremendously, almost larger than any one organization. Of course, IPRA tries to, meet people's needs and network people with one another. And we've had to keep a fairly loose structure to do that, because people don't want to be tied down into one single organization. And if you make people choose, for example, one professional association, well, the political scientists are always going to choose the political science organization. The historians are always going to choose the history organization. So it's a relatively small group if they have to choose one professional association to pay dues to or to go to conferences of. They won't necessarily choose us, even if they're deeply involved. So we want to keep it loose. We want people to be good and strong historians, philosophers, political scientists. And then, while they're doing their good work, their powerful work, their important award-winning work in their own disciplines, to see IPRA and to see peace studies as a comfortable space to do interdisciplinary work. So I don't know if that fully answers your question about our impact right now, except that I think the field is growing. I think the discourse in the academy and outside of it of the need to discuss the creative resolving of conflict is widespread. I think it's not as it was at our founding, a little thing that a few people whispered about in the hallways. It's an acceptable thing to talk about at the administration level, at the institution level. And it's no coincidence, again, that we have in the US alone several college presidents or vice presidents, chancellors that have come out of peace studies discipline. So it's not that they're doing peace studies work per se, they're running the college, they're running the whole university, but they come out of our discipline because I think, number one, we have some of the best and brightest people willing to look at things in more than one way, willing to look at the complexities and nuances of things, but also because I think it's become more acceptable, much more acceptable, to have general conversations about peace and conflict and creative conflict resolution in the academy and in the K through 12 high schools and middle schools and younger generations. People learning to teach students and youngsters to become mediators and peer mediators. So as that grows, so too does the field. And I think one of the crucial parts of work now, in order to better answer your question, is to try to quantify it just a little bit so we have a better database of who's who out there throughout the world.
Thank you so much for answering this question. As someone who's new to this field, I've definitely learned a lot, so thank you so much. So my second question is about democracy. As I was telling you some times ago, Tunisia is going, for example, I'm talking about Tunisia because it's the case I know about. So we've had lots of troubles with democracy. At the beginning, it was a really good thing, but then it gave floor to many bad people, and then people decided to stop democracy, and then we are trying to gain it back. So it's like, it's a I don't know how to say it, but for now it's a little bit of a chaos. So what do you think about democracy? Do you think it is suitable for all countries? Do you believe that democracy is a good solution for peace, for example, inside countries? And if not, is there anything that can replace democracy?
Well, let me say this first. You know me, I'm never going to answer any questions in an easy form. But to me, democracy has become such a loaded word, like many of our words, like revolution, like nonviolence, like solidarity, that I almost feel like I can't answer that question without figuring out what our definition is, what you mean by that. Because participatory democracy, what I would call participatory democracy, people in a community, at a community level, being able to affect their own lives through their work, through their labor, through their ability to obtain goods and services, through their ability to be represented by people who hold their interests, and fight for them. That participatory grassroots democracy is, I think, powerful, important, and made for all. It's not a cookie cutter made for all. Different communities, based on their cultures, based on their histories, based on their geographies, based on their resources, will have a slightly different looking participatory democracy than another community. But the basic idea of democracy, participatory grassroots democracy, is strong. On the other hand, democracy is so often used, especially by the US, by my own government, especially in the West, as a catchphrase for electoral voting of politicians that will often serve far away from the grassroots community and often have interests other than the community's interests at hand. I think, again, if you just look at the US Senate, perhaps the most powerful of the congressional, legislative, lawmaking, democratic bodies in the US, the number of senators that are actually connected to their grassroots communities and are seen by even their supportive electors as connected to them has got to be an infinitesimally small minority. Congress people of the House of Representatives don't do much better. So what we see is these catchwords for democracy that are in fact so atrophied that they're almost altogether useless. So when we hear radicals, communists, socialists ask questions like democracy, can't we do better than that? I think what they're asking for is not that we don't have participation from masses of people, but rather that the ideas of electoral federalized democracies be improved for the people. Perhaps the most overt and obvious example of this is political versus economic democracy. So often when democracy, that word is used, we're talking about voting one person into office every couple of years, every 4 years, every 8 years, what have you. And we can have sometimes very shallow, but nonetheless some selecting of a group of individuals to have one be the mayor or the governor or the representative legislator or whatever, or the president. But economics will never change, and you don't get to vote on that. So economic democracy, the idea that a group of people have some way of taking care of one another in society, that you will get something back for what you put in. You won't have to work 5 jobs or 3 jobs or 2 jobs and no vacation just to put a slice of bread and a little bit of butter on the table. No offense to the gluten free people who don't do bread and butter, but the fact of the matter is, we have a planet that has enough fruit and the ability to grow things for there to be no starvation. Why is there starvation? Well, some of the reason is because of a lack of democratic distribution, also sometimes known as greed, where people hold on to land or own land as property, and their goal or their self-professed goal is to make as much money off it as possible, not to feed the people, not to make sure that there's literacy and education for all, not to make sure that there's healthcare for all. Again, I am an internationalist. I'm a Secretary General of a respected international non-governmental organization. But I go back to my own country, the US, where we have some of the absolute best, most extraordinary, specialized health care, doctors, and machinery that money can buy. And that's what you need to get those resources. You need piles and piles of money. People won't be refused service most of the time in hospitals, although it's something that's very, very hard to get into the better hospitals. But those that do get in, once they come out, will receive a bill beyond anything they can ever pay. It's almost like a joke. And so people are frightened to go to the hospital. And sometimes people do, on the other hand, at the other extreme, go to the hospital they go to the emergency room for every little cut, every little cough, in part because they're worried, but also in part because there's no organized family community-based healthcare system in the US. So the ER is the only place that's open and that they have to take you. And so at least you'll get relief for the moment, and then you'll have to ignore the exorbitant bills that they'll send you later on. So we're looking at a system of healthcare, of education, of basic labor, vocational, economic working that is highly, highly, highly undemocratic in most countries, certainly in the capitalist countries, in the global north and the global south. And yet, when you talk about economic democracy, or when people talk about democracy in general, they rarely think about or talk about economic democracy at all. So if you vote someone in every 4 years, even if they're very unconnected to who you are, what you do, and what you need as a community, then you live in a democratic country. Even if you have, a tiny, tiny fraction of the percentage of the people owning the vast majority of the wealth, the land, it seems like even the air we breathe. So we live in a very, very undemocratic world from that point of view, from a participatory mass grassroots point of view. And in that sense, democracy is essential for peace and justice. But it's not about voting. Voting is at best a very, very small part of it. I used to say, and there are big debates in a U.S. left that's in many ways quite foolish. But I used to say when there were these big debates every few years, don't vote. It only encourages them. Stay away, or you've got to vote. This is the most important election of your lives. I always said, look, both of these extremes are incorrect. I live in a place where I have the ability to vote. So I vote. Every year or every 4 years for president, it takes me about maybe a half hour or an hour to take time out of my day, go to the local voting place, pull the lever, I voted. I do that. I've done that all my life. Now, if the only thing I do for democracy is a half hour or an hour once a year or once every 4 years, what can we expect? It's like saying the only thing I'm going to do for my intellect is 1 hour a year. I'll read something. Or the only thing I'll do for my love relationship, I love you, my partner, my children, is 1 hour a year or 1 hour every 4 years. I'll do something nice to you. Well, that's not love. That's not education. That's not democracy. If we only spend the time it takes to pull a lever, we're not building democracy. We have to spend more time as a global society to push and struggle and make true democracy for all a thing. If we do that, then democracy has value. If we're just talking about pulling a lever once every few years, not worth so much at all.
That's definitely true. So the problem is in the definition of democracy and the main components. We usually tend to mix democracy with just voting or witnessing elections or something, but it is much more than that. So thank you. Speaking of participation and dialogues and all of that, are all parties supposed to be involved in dialogues? Like, should we give the right to every how to say it, not person, but every representation and every side? Should we give them the right to participate in a dialogue? Are they all worth listening to? Like including radicals, including extremists, including everything?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't feel like I mean, I do find that some of the most interesting dialogues and conversations working towards peace with justice come from diverse voices, and that sometimes we get most stuck by excluding certain voices and perspectives. That said, I don't think it could ever be argued that all voices are equally significant or important. And so I think you have a cautionary problematic in both directions. If you're excluding too many voices, then you've got some problem. That you're not really dealing with the whole of an issue. On the other hand, if you pretend that every voice has somehow equal say, then you're creating a balance that isn't real, because there are. It's like in mediation. If you have 2 or 3 parties in a mediation, and some are very, very powerful, either because of social graces, it's a bunch of men that are more powerful than women in a particularly patriarchal society, or a bunch of white people that are more powerful than so-called people of color, people of African or Latino or indigenous descents, etc. In a racist or white supremacist society, the super rich versus the poor in capitalist societies. You can't go into a mediation pretending that for this 5 minutes or this 5 hours or these 5 days we're all equal, because once the mediation is over, you walk outside, and once again, some have a lot of power and some have very little at all. So it's the same thing for the question you asked. it's important to recognize those real power dynamics as we go into conversations and dialogues. That said, the idea that only the most powerful, there are societies that have 2 or 3 main political parties, and they're the only ones who get any press coverage or get to be in debates. And that to me is always problematic, even though sometimes political debates with 7 or 8 or 10 people can get very chaotic and crazy. I think in many ways that's the best way to go forward, to have a number of voices competing for a certain space and time and attention and support. And then, and then you see, depending on what behind the scenes stuff may be possible. But if there's no rigging, if there's no, if there's no real sense that the most powerful are always going to win, just because that power is the only thing that matters in this particular scenario, I think in general it benefits to have more inclusive conversations than exclusive ones.
All right, so we involve them, but we don't give them enough we don't give them equal importance to other other voices. All right, which makes sense definitely. So still in this topic, like peace and war, militarism. Okay, so I've seen in one of your books, at least in the title, it has anti-militarism. Recently, we've all seen what happened in Afghanistan when the U.S. pulled away. What happened with the whole country. So it is, of course, a personal opinion. Feel free to state it or not. What do you think about this? Are you agreeing with what the U.S. did, which is like let them decide what they want and now just pull away, or should the U.S. have stayed a little more, or where are you in this situation?
I mean, you asked about militarism generally, and then particularly about U.S. policies in terms of current Afghanistan. To me, the problem when you run something more akin to an empire than a nation state is that you almost can't help by doing things that extend beyond well beyond justice and to policies that are really about control of resources. So I don't think we ever went into Afghanistan, the U.S., because of an actual concern for U.S. or Afghani peoples. I don't think that's the case. I think we went into Afghanistan in part because we need to have some revenge. We need to have some sense that the specter of 9/11 was going to be overcome. So there's a basic psychic revenge fantasy that filled the hearts and minds of many Americans, including those in power. I think part of it was, a still desire to overcome the Soviet threat, even though the Soviets were no more. The idea that Afghanistan couldn't come under control of some other, that they need to be brought into the fold of U.S. and Western empire building. But I think first and foremost, we're looking at issues of natural resources, oil, and the ability to control the flow and pipelines surrounding the Afghan region of the world. And so the fact is, the mistake was not how we withdrew, but how and when we got in the first place. Once we got in, it's a quagmire. It's a series of disasters that are almost inevitable. And so, I believe that there was nothing to be gained by staying in longer. I don't think staying in longer would have meant oh, now the Taliban will be crushed now. Well, nor do I think that that pulling out was done so perfectly. The very presence of the U.S. in Afghanistan certainly wasn't helping a bunch of Afghani women or Afghani democracy. In some ways, the best thing we could have done was leave Afghan alone, and I think they'd be quite a bit further along in terms of democracy and in terms of women's rights than they are now. Having said that, yes, I mean, ultimately, it's very hard for an outside force to create the proper conditions for women's and girls' participation, for lasting peace, for democracy. Again, democracy by definition can't be some, military power from above and from outside to come in and say, you will have democracy. That goes against the definition of what democracy is. So, yeah, was it the best, withdrawal possible? No. Would staying in longer have been particularly helpful? No. Well, what's the answer then? Don't build empires is the answer. Whether you're the U.S. or any other country, don't build empires. Don't go into the first place to tell other people what to do. If you have an idea of some great society, lead by example. There are great things happening all around the world. There are great things happening in the Americas. There are great things happening in small communities in southern Mexico, led by the Zapatistas and others. Look at local, autonomous, democratic, people-centered movement building, community building, and then try to replicate that. Don't build empires and send armed forces in there to gift people with the gift of democracy. It doesn't work that way.
Thank you so much. All right, so my next question is about religion. So many people claim that religion is the main cause or one of the main causes of conflict, of wars, while others say, no, you can just look at old wars and they are caused by many other things, and not specifically religion. So is religion a cause of conflict and wars, or is it an opportunity for peace, or is it just neutral? So what is religion? What does religion have to do with peace and conflict?
I think the biggest cause of war, and I think research bears this out, has been intolerance and greed. It has something to do with this empire building that I just spoke about. If you are a band of rebels, even if you're a band of rebels who happen to be the president of a country and your closest allies, maybe even especially so, or a band of rebels who happen to own a huge multinational, multi-billion-dollar corporation. If you're a band of rebels, that gets to fly into outer space for 10 seconds with William Shatner and Captain Kirk because you have the billions of dollars to do that. If you're a small band of people who, because of your trajectory in life, because of the power and wealth you've accumulated, if you're a small grouping who decides that your way, by definition, is going to be best and has to be followed, and you're not so sure about all the others, maybe simply because life is good as a billionaire. Life is really, really good as a billionaire. Life is good as a petty dictator. You get to have what you want when you want, and you have a whole group of people who will deliver it to you, or else. So that's the cause of war and injustice, as far as I see. And then we have all kinds of excuses as to why it's really okay for me to have all the goodies and you to have a life of slavery. Obviously, it's because I'm Christian and you're not, or because I'm white and you're not, or because I'm of European descent and you're not, I'm so smart that I got to accumulate all these billions of dollars, and you're not, which obviously must mean you're dumb or you don't work very hard. I mean, forget the fact that daddy had millions and I inherited the millions from daddy, and then I invest them, and so I made more because we live in a world where the structures allow millionaires to become billionaires and allow people who are very poor to become even poorer. So the fact of the matter is, war is not based on religion. And I'd even say war isn't necessarily only based on class issues, though I think class hits more to the root of things than religion. But war is based whenever a small group of people decide that all the power they have is correct for them to keep, and they're going to keep it no matter what. And sometimes that does play out on a very local level. Wait, this is my little piece of land. Oh, but wait, those 3 inches are really my pieces of land. Oh, we're going to fight over those 3 inches. Yes, that's a cause of war as well. Of course, local conflicts, turf battles, etc. And, your way of life is a little different because, you like to keep the window open that much, but I really think it's too cold. You got to keep the window open that much. So, people have their differences. People can figure out reasons to fight over anything. But the fact of the matter is, it's intolerance. It's saying we can't compromise. Let's do something in the middle. Let's have it this way for some nights and that way for some nights. We can have Christians and Muslims and Jews. We can have people who don't believe in monotheism at all. We can have a grouping of people living together and figure out that it doesn't really matter who owns Jerusalem. What a ridiculous concept. Jerusalem is a historic place. It's an historic place of great and tremendous spiritual, religious, and historic significance to at least 3 main religions. Who owns it? I mean, isn't that fundamentally antithetical to spirituality and God anyway? And God said on the 6th day, let there be ownership. No, I didn't read that in any version, in the Quran or the Old Testament. I didn't read anywhere that God said, let there be ownership. So it does seem to me, as someone who at some point before my work as Secretary General of the International Peace Research Association, I was the U.S. National Chair of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, an explicitly interfaith group, and I still work with the International FOR. It seems to me that religion itself is not the fundamental cause of war. Intolerance over religion is. And then you could say the same thing about gender and gender binaries and non-binaries, about patriarchy, especially, and the hatred of women or the desire to control women and girls. Certainly racism and imperialism, the question that, somehow because of your skin pigmentation, or more likely where you were born, the fact is we think of Africa in many cases as this, dark and desolate and difficult place. Africa is African, racism is racism, because Africa is by far and away the richest continent on the planet. It's not only the birthplace of modern civilization, or of humankind, it's also the place where some of the greatest genius existed. So what happens when you have great genius and great wealth? Well, if you're not looking for distribution and you're not looking for the millions upon millions of Africans to share that wealth, but you're a small group of, I don't know, say Europeans who want to control all that, want to scramble around to figure out which piece will be yours and which piece will be mine, can't let the local people actually control it. What more undemocratic concept can you possibly have? Well, the scramble for Africa and the colonialism and neocolonialism that ensues, and the work it takes to have a small group of outsiders control all that wisdom and all that wealth, well, that's the ingredient for war right there, and never-ending war. So until you end these basic structures of oppression, until you liberate all the people of the world, there'll be war and rumors of war, as Haile Selassie and Bob Marley said.
And do you see that happening soon?
An end to all of it?
Yes.
No, I wish I did. That's a nice dream. I think we brought ourselves as a species and as a planet on the verge of more and more catastrophes. Certainly, we see that in terms of climate crisis. So I think as we look towards these catastrophes, these potentially, I don't really feel like we're about to blow the planet up, but these catastrophes that are already, as we see, seeing to the elimination of the extinction of various key species, we begin to reflect more existentially on how to look at these things from a holistic peace perspective. So, do I see, true and lasting peace and justice happening? I'd have to say I don't see it around the corner. But I do think that we have a growing number of people, new generations of people, who, in thinking about survival, in thinking about, oh, if we don't do something soon, all is lost. And rather than think about all is lost and just throw our hands up and go and party, we have to do something. I think that is encouraging. And I think that encouragement may see us turn some corners. I think we'll see us turn some corners in new directions of peace movement building by the middle of the 21st century, by 2050. And I think, we can't, we're never very good at predicting. Historians can tell you, hopefully, if we're very, very sharp, what happened recently, what really happened, not just the headlines or the mythology. But we're very, very bad at predicting the future. And any economist who tells you that that's what they do is lying. So the fact of the matter is, I'd like to hope that there's a new consciousness as we get to the verge, to the precipice of some of these horrific possibilities, and we see actual extinction of certain species taking place around us. That we will have a growing, not just a growing heartfelt sense that we need to change, but a growing strategic sense. It's about power, and therefore it's not just, oh, please, now that I understand it all, can't we all just get along? No, it's not just about education or about good feelings. It's about a strategic, tactically sophisticated confrontation with power. We, the peacemakers, we, the IPRAs of this world, are outnumbered and outgunned in terms of basic armed forces. We're not outnumbered in terms of we, the people. So the question is, can we get enough of the community-based grassroots mass of the people, a truly democratic mass, struggling for, in a variety of tactics with a very strategic orientation, real change, saying we will withdraw our bodies and our labor. We will go on a massive global general strike until real change takes place, until real democratization and peace takes place. Until that happens, until we, the organized peacemakers, organize others with that strategic orientation, until we use every direct action, every resistance tactic we can to bring business as usual, in other words, war as usual, to a halt, we won't get there. Can we get there? If I didn't believe we could, I wouldn't do what I do. Do I see it around the corner? I think we have a lot of work to do before it's around the corner. But Karama Habli, Tunisia, your generation, you can take us to the next steps. And then the younger generations, even more so, to the next steps. So I think we're heading in the right direction, but I still think we have a lot of work to do.
Amen. I hope so. I really hope so. All right. So there's like one question that you have already kind of answered, and I have it written right here. Like you've read my mind. But it was about Africa. I was going to say, so Africa is the richest continent out of all. We have gold, we have petroleum, gas, we have all these natural resources. Yet when you see the living standards and when you see the everything happening in African countries, you feel like this is the poorest place in the whole world. So, what is stopping African countries from evolving or from becoming the next Europe or the next America or the next, I don't know, the next best thing, I guess?
A lot of work has been put in over a long period of time to portray Africa to the world and to Africans themselves as the dark continent. A lot of work has been put into the myth, even within the peace studies field, that Africa is a place of war, war, war. Oh, you know, I'm part of an organization, I won't name this one, although I may have mentioned the name already, that's thinking about having its first major global peace conference on the continent. Now, I think it's nothing short of shameful that some organizations that are 100 plus years old and that profess to be international still haven't had a single one of their general conferences on African continent. I have to say, I feel like from IPRA's point of view, we're doing quite well. In addition to having our own African Peace Research and Education Association, our own regional affiliate that has many conferences in Africa, the general IPRA grouping has itself had several conferences in Africa over the decades. And not just in easy to do places like South Africa. There was a plan that one of the former Secretary Generals had about doing it in his home country, in Sierra Leone. And some of us, myself included, who are both strong Pan-Africanists and who love the idea, but also have been to Sierra Leone, said, oh my God, the infrastructure there, the economy there, the recent conflict there, how is it going to be possible? I mean, that's really, we're not talking about, a place that has, good access to Europe. We're not talking about Tunisia or Senegal or South Africa or whatever. Sierra Leone is really a tough place to do a global conference. Well, we did it, and it was one of the most exciting, vibrant, successful, logistically smooth, financially stable conferences we'd ever done. And so now there's another group, not IPRA, that's planning a conference in late 2022 in Africa. And already I'm hearing now, will it be safe? Will it be possible? How will I get there? Well, frankly, I built a conference in 2014 of a group called War Resistance International in South Africa, in Cape Town. The Cape Town City Hall and the mayor supported the conference and gave us the facilities pretty much for free. One of the greatest peacemakers of our last 100 years, Nobel Peace Laureate Archbishop Desmond Tutu, came and opened the conference. We got funds that covered all the costs. War Resistance International had almost no costs ultimately. And people still said, will it be safe? Will it be okay? Can I go there? What food will I eat? So, there's been a lot of money, billions of dollars over the years to make it into the minds of the world and the minds of people of Africa that we have this dark continent here. In earnest, often IPRA has conferences where they have secretary generals. So my co-secretary general is from Kenya, and our last conference at the beginning of 2021 was in Nairobi, Kenya, and because of COVID, also virtually. And I said all along, I'm from the US, we're not gonna have a conference in the US because the US is really where we have instability. And the first instability is many of people around the world who are IPRA members and IPRA leaders would not get visas, would not be allowed to come in because my country has such restrictive measures about letting people in. We just had a major international tribunal around US human rights abuses against Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples. Karama, I know you know this well because you were a huge support person for it. Two of our chief jurors, 2 of 9 of the chief jurors, couldn't get in. And we don't have an exact reason. Here's why, but we suspect various in Tunisian not so democratic, not so open reasons for it on the part of the U.S. State Department. So we decided that for the conference that might have happened in the U.S. in 2023, we're going to have it with some very close colleagues of ours in the Caribbean, in Trinidad. So it could actually be a place where people from North America and South America come together. And because of the Trinidadian history, it'll also be a Pan-African conference. So it's just to say, one has to flip the script about what one thinks of as resources and power. So we can say we know that Africa, the African continent, has great wisdom and great resources because they do. But we can also find a million reasons why this worry or that worry is going to suggest that it can't be done. Will you really have the facilities to host us? Yes. Will you really be able to get the food that'll be safe? Yes. Can we really fly? Yes. Yes. All of the things can be done, but not if we keep in our minds, not if we keep in our very undemocratic, very provincial, very suspicious, very intolerable and intolerant minds, this idea that the other that we're not very familiar with somehow isn't quite right. And we can construct all kinds of images that sound really convincing. But wait, there's recent war there. Wait, what about COVID? Well, I don't mean to make light of any of these things. All of these things are real. Just like it's real that, down the block in parts of the US, not so far from my home, we have extraordinary acts of gun violence. Out of the blue, ones you couldn't predict, and you never know when the shooter is going to come into your school or your room and turn that semi-automatic that they got at the local supermarket without any kind of anything, turn that gun on you. But do people say we can't have conferences in the US? No, everyone wants to have the conferences here. New York, everyone wants to come to New York for a conference. It's exciting, it's fun. I'll spend some extra days, I'll see some sights, I'll go to some restaurants. Well, yeah, sure, come. I'm a born and raised New Yorker, I love it. But to think that somehow New York is not a violent place, and say South Sudan is a violent place, is to misunderstand the nature of violence in the world today, to misunderstand fundamentally what safety is. We take a risk by going anywhere and everywhere. At this moment, New York is actually pretty good in terms of statistics. We had the money and the logistical wherewithal to get COVID vaccines for a massive number of our population. And before that, towards the beginning of the pandemic, New York was the worst place to be in the world, the absolute worst place to be. So one has to be smart, of course, but to say, yeah, I don't think I'm going to go to Africa. I literally had one colleague of mine years ago, I guess because I have the skin pigmentation and I have the body parts and genitalia that I do, that this guy thought it would be safe. And he said to me, I'm really never going to go to a conference in Africa. I was flabbergasted. What? I'm really never going to go to a conference in Africa. What do you mean? I don't know. I just don't feel right about it. It's just not. Maybe Morocco. I don't know. Possibly South Africa if you tell me exactly ahead of time what hotels. But the rest of the continent, This from an internationalist peacemaker, I almost fell on the floor. I couldn't, I even now can't speak to it, because it speaks to all of the reasons why we have war, all of the intolerances, all of the lack of imaginations, the idea that somehow Africa is this scary, dark place where there's militarism and disease and war. And one needs only to go to venture a step out and say, oh, that's not Africa. That's not Tunisia. It's not Algeria. You don't have to go to Morocco that has a colonial holding of Western Sahara. One of the only, maybe the only nation in Africa that's not really fully accepted into the African Union because its politics are so colonial and neo-colonial, so unjust in their foundations. Yeah, you can go to Ghana. Why don't you check out Mali, one of the oldest civilizations in the world? Yeah, there's a lot of violence in the Congo, but there's also a lot of extraordinary grassroots organizing. Just the way there's a lot of violence in the US and some maybe less extraordinary, but okay, grassroots organizing as well. So you asked that question, why? I mean, obviously, maybe not so obviously, before I was involved in peace studies, I think I mentioned, contemporary African history is my base scholarship and work and writing. And so I could go on about this for a while. But, the reason why Africa seems like this place of violence and injustice is because the world has devoted lots and lots of resources from before the scramble for Africa in the 1800s right till today, and neo-colonial realities. We look at the place called Ambazonia, English-speaking Cameroon, where a group of largely nonviolent activists have for decades been trying to get their little piece of sovereignty, their little piece of independence. And they're very clear. Cameroon is their colonizing power, but they're equally clear. Cameroon doesn't do what they do without French neo-colonialism on top of Cameroon. If French said tomorrow to Cameroon, Ambazonia must be free, Ambazonia would be free. So we're looking at a world that still has France and the US, England and Germany, that still has a lot of neo-colonial and colonial power working to make sure that the Africa that we know can be the center of world civilization can never be even a shell of what the European Union is. Because a truly integrated Africa could possibly lead us to certain different ways of looking at things, but it would mean a whole-scale end of modern imperialism. And ending modern imperialism, like ending patriarchy and capitalism, is going to take this massive people's peace movement, like the one we spoke about just a few minutes ago.
Thank you, very well explained. And it's very sad that, as you said, even Africans, we tend to think the same. You'll probably rarely meet any Tunisian or Algerian or Moroccan that have been in other places around Africa. And part of it also is because there's no African Union, so traveling around Africa is extremely costly. So I went to Italy and Spain, and the ticket was very cheap. And then I tried to look for tickets to Morocco or like other African countries. They were times 4 and times 5 the amount I paid to go to European countries, which is insane. And like you have to apply for visa as well to go to a country around the corner. Egypt and Tunisia, like I don't know, like they're right around the corner, and we need visa, we need to pay, we need everything. So it's not it's also Africans, like also an African problem, not just like an outsider influence or whatever. Like I wish we were like the European Union, for example. So.
I mean, that needs to be developed, through African airlines and African governments cooperating. Obviously, those systems were created long ago by non-Africans, but it is an advance that someone like you, Karama, from Tunisia, can consider yourself an African. And so often North Africa and the rest of the continent is split into
True.
pieces. And even myself as an outsider, I was schooled in a particular way, and I'm very, grateful for my mentors and my schooling. I started out really as a student of, and then a scholar of, and then a solidarity activist with Mozambique and Zimbabwe. And then from there, got, more involved in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. But, because my publisher of my first books was Eritrean, and he said, you have to travel to the Horn of Africa. So I did. And then because I had friends and then relatives in Ghana and West Africa, okay. And then a certain project I helped lead with, actually a group of psychiatrists and psychologists and educators, took me to recently war-torn places. So Sierra Leone, Liberia, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Rwanda, Burundi. So I really became a Pan-Africanist, not just in theory, but because I traveled to lots and lots of different parts, every region of the vast continent. But people don't even understand the vastness of it. You say to the US, how large is Africa? The idea that in the US you could actually take the geography of the entire United States of America and times it by three USs, and put that in Africa geographically and still have room for more. So the vastness of it and the diversity of it and the need to connect pieces in ways that are more rational than that. Yes, you can get a ticket to Italy off the continent way easier and way cheaper than you can get to someplace right around the corner. That's an African problem, and Africa has to solve Africa's problems. But we can't go about those solvings without realizing that there's a long and still powerful history and current reality of a lot of superpowers that don't want Africa to be able to solve Africa's problems, just the way they don't want peacemakers to be able to build mass movements for peace, for lasting peace, for a peace born of justice and true democracy, economic democracy, because that means giving up power. And the rich and the powerful of this world don't want to do that and won't do that without a struggle.
Thank you so much. And we hope that's better. Can I ask one last question?
Sure.
Okay, so in order to end it on a positive note, I've looked through some of your interviews on YouTube, and I found an interview in 2016. It's with I think an organization called IKEDA, I think. And you spoke about critical thinking. You said that you really encourage critical thinking and the development of critical thinking for students. And you proposed it as a kind of a solution for intolerance. Could you go through that again, like about the importance of critical thinking skills in for this new generation, at least? And can you propose like ways on how to develop this skill?
Yeah, well, I guess we can end on a positive note in that sense, just by saying that, as an educator and as someone who for years, I started out working in New York City high schools, not colleges, and working as a high school historian, a history teacher, social studies teacher, they call it. And it seems that at the same time, I learned the most about teaching skills from early childhood teachers of 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds and 3-year-olds and early childhood, because in there you really begin to understand development, intellectual and emotional development as humans. And I think it's very, very clear. It's clearest to say that the basis of critical thinking, the basis of being able to understand that because something is on the web or something is written on a book doesn't make it truth just by the virtue of it being published, but then one has to look at 2 or 3 or 5 different realities different interpretations of a given event and be able to sift through them and be able to intellectually ask yourself, where does this come from? From what perspective was this written? Is this a point of view that makes sense, that seems truthful, that I can believe in, that I can trust? So, you'll hear stories. I'll talk about, iconic figures. You'll hear stories about Nelson Mandela being a great, great man, an amazing, extraordinary man. And then you'll hear stories about him being a communist. And then you'll hear stories about him being an opportunist. He gave away everything. And then you'll hear stories about him being absolutely committed to the end. He stayed in prison all those 27 plus years because he wouldn't give up the struggle. And then you'll hear these stories about him being a pacifist. Oh, he just loved peace. He forgave his jailer. He loved all people. And then you'll hear the stories about him being an armed struggle advocate. He was the one who started the armed struggle in South Africa, and would never give it up, and didn't give it up until they let him out of jail, and finally they did negotiate a settlement. Well, which of these is true? Are they all true? Do they all have pieces of the truth? And who are you going to believe? Well, I was fortunate enough to meet Nelson Mandela, and I've written about him extensively, and I'm not going to give the answer. But I will say this: critical thinking is about asking the questions. And finally, I'll say, it's Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, and Che Guevara from Argentine and Cuban Revolution, that understood that real pedagogy, real education had always to be about naming one's own reality. It's the basics of literacy, but it's also the basics of critical thinking, and in some ways the basics of social change. It's not just saying this is a table or this is a chair. It's a saying, I'm not experiencing justice around me. I'm oppressed in these ways. And yet, what a beautiful tree. What an amazing sunset. So as you name your own realities, as you understand that realities are complex, wait a second. That thing they wrote in the newspaper about the demonstration I just was at yesterday doesn't sound anything like the demonstration I was at. When one begins to name one's own reality and understand that reality is complex, it's more than just one truth, that there are experiments with truth, as Gandhi said, that there are multiple truths in all things, then one begins to understand that one has power to also change things in the naming. So you say, I love that beautiful tree. I'm going to fight that it doesn't get chopped down. I love this community. I'm going to fight that it doesn't get bulldozed over. I'm going to fight that we have some economic sharing here, even if right outside the community, there's the worst kind of capitalist, subdivisions, and very rich and very poor. In this community, we're going to try something different. So by looking at conscious ascension, the consciousness of people, by looking at critical thinking on a basic level, one begins to look at how to make social change, first for small groups and communities, and then for the world entire.
Thank you so much for answering all the questions. Wow, like I didn't feel this 90 minutes. It went very fast, and I really enjoyed listening to you. Thank you for opening your heart to this interview.
Thank you for asking some good questions. I don't know how much in the background you hear little dings, but already people are calling me and saying, "Wait a second, you're supposed to be with me." So let me get back to the rest of things. But really,